I came home after 2 quiet weeks away, just a short trip to visit an old friend. But the moment I opened the door, something felt wrong. The air smelled like new paint, perfume, and something colder: ownership. My photos were gone. My bed was gone. And standing right there, hanging new curtains in my room, was my son's wife. She turned to me with that calm little smile and said, "We turned this into a guest room. I'll be using it now." That sentence, "This is mine now," burned more than any insult I've ever heard, because it wasn't about the room. It was about erasing who I was inside the house I built with my hands. Before I tell you what happened next, if you've ever felt disrespected by someone you once built your world for, take a second to subscribe, like, or even comment below. Not for the numbers, but because stories like this remind people that quiet men still exist. Men who build, forgive, and rebuild when others try to take everything. Now, let me tell you what really happened that night. It was late afternoon when Walter Briggs pulled up to the house by the lake, the same one he'd built with his bare hands 43 years ago. The gravel crunched under his boots and the place looked newer somehow. Brighter, but colder too, like it had been touched by someone who didn't know what warmth meant. He just spent 2 weeks in Michigan helping an old friend fix up a porch. It was good work, honest work. Nothing like sitting around waiting for time to forget your name. He'd missed his house, though. The smell of pine, the sound of the floorboards creaking under his steps, like the house itself greeted him. Only this time it didn't. The second he opened the door, something felt wrong. The air smelled sharp, like fresh paint and perfume. Not Helen's lavender, not the scent he still caught on her old scarves. No, this was chemical, foreign, too clean. He set his duffel bag by the door, listening. There were footsteps upstairs, quick, careless ones, and a voice humming to itself. "Sophie." He walked up the stairs slowly, his hand brushing the railing he'd carved himself in 1982. Every notch, every groove was still there, his story etched into the wood. But when he reached the hallway, his chest tightened. The door to his bedroom, his and Helen's, was open. Inside, the walls were painted a dull gray. The bed he'd built from oak, the same bed where his wife took her last breath, was gone. The framed photos that once lined the wall, their wedding day, Dylan's first steps, the fishing trip in '97, all missing. In their place, a desk, a ring light, boxes labeled Sophie's office. She stood by the window, hanging curtains the color of champagne. She didn't even turn around when she said, almost cheerful, "Oh, you're back early, Walter." He didn't move. "What happened to my room?" Sophie shrugged. "We turned it into a guest room. Actually," she smoothed the curtain, "I'll be using it for work mostly. You know, my business meetings, content stuff. Dylan and I thought it'd be more productive." Walter blinked slowly. His hands, rough and scarred, clenched behind his back. He looked around at the soulless desk, the white rug that didn't belong, the faint smell of varnish covering the life he'd lived in this room. He spoke quietly, but the words landed like a hammer. "Then start looking for your own house." Sophie froze, the air went still. He didn't yell, he didn't have to. His voice carried that weight only men like him could hold, the kind built from silence, years, and sawdust. Her smile faltered. "Excuse me." Walter took one more step inside. "You heard me." He ran a hand along the wall, smooth now, stripped of history. "You don't paint over a man's life and call it redecorating." Sophie's tone hardened. "We just needed space." Dylan agreed. Walter let out a dry laugh. "Of course he did." He turned to the doorway, pausing only once. "You know, Sophie, you can change the color of the walls, but the foundation doesn't move. And this house," he tapped the door frame with his finger, "this house still knows who built it." He left her standing there, curtain in hand, unsure if she'd just been threatened or educated. Truth was both. Downstairs, the living room looked different too. The handmade bookshelf was gone, replaced by a glossy white cabinet. Even the rug was new. He walked toward the kitchen. His old kettle, the one Helen had used every morning, was gone too. Jesus, he muttered under his breath, pulling open drawers that no longer held his things. He looked through the back window. The lake shimmered with that golden light you only see before sunset. For a moment, he wished Helen were there. She'd probably say something like, "Let it be, Walter, it's just paint." But even she knew it wasn't about paint. It was about respect. When you build something with your hands, whether it's a chair, a home, or a family, it's not just wood and nails. It's who you are. And watching someone treat it like clutter, that hits deeper than any insult. He sat down on the old bench by the kitchen table, ran his thumb along the edge. There was a small nick where Helen had once dropped a carving knife. He'd kept it that way. Little imperfections reminded him the house had lived too. But now everything felt sanitized, perfect, polished, and completely lifeless. Upstairs, he heard Sophie calling Dylan. "Yes, he's home. No, it's fine. He's just surprised. We'll figure it out." Her voice trailed off, but the words echoed long enough. "We'll figure it out," like he was some problem to manage. He chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "Figure me out, huh? Good luck." When Dylan finally got home, it was dark outside. He looked tired, guilty even, but too soft to admit it. "Dad, listen," he started. "Sophie's been working from home. We thought it'd make sense to use that room. You've got the den, right?" Walter tilted his head. "The den? Yeah, you know, the one near the garage. You could set up your stuff there. More privacy." Walter stared at his son, the same son who once stood on a milk crate beside him, sanding wood for the first time. He could still remember saying, "When you build something, make sure it lasts." Now, looking at him, soft shoulders, nervous eyes, he realized Dylan had forgotten what that meant. "Privacy," Walter said finally. "I built this place so none of us had to hide." "Dad, no." Walter's voice dropped lower. "You know what hurts, son? It's not that she took the room, it's that you didn't stop her." Dylan exhaled. "It's just space, Dad. Don't make it bigger than it is." Walter nodded slowly. "You're right, it's just space." He picked up his coat, "and I built every inch of it." He walked out to the porch, leaving Dylan standing there, lost between guilt and confusion. Outside, the night had settled in soft wind over the lake, the faint smell of pine. Walter leaned against the railing, the wood creaking just like always. At least that part hadn't changed. He looked up at the window where his old room used to be. Sophie's silhouette moved behind the curtain, his curtain, now pale and thin like something borrowed. He whispered almost to himself, "She thought I'd let it go." A moment passed and the faintest smirk crossed his face. She forgot who taught her husband to build. He stayed out there a while, watching the reflection of the house ripple across the lake. A man can lose a lot in life, his wife, his strength, even his place in the world. But if there's one thing he keeps, it's memory. And Walter remembered every nail, every beam, every laugh that echoed through this house long before Sophie learned how to hold a hammer. He knew then, this wasn't about a room, it was about reclaiming something bigger. Dignity doesn't shout, it rebuilds. He turned back toward the front door, the shadow of resolve hardening in his eyes. Whatever came next, he wouldn't beg, he wouldn't argue, and he damn sure wouldn't be erased. He taught Dylan how to build a home. Now, it was time to teach him what happens when you forget who built it. And as the lights flickered upstairs, the new lights Sophie had installed, Walter smiled to himself. Some lessons don't need words. They need patience and time. because wood bends before it breaks, and so do men. If you've ever watched someone strip away what you built, your work, your love, your place, you know that silence isn't weakness. It's the moment before you pick up the hammer again. Stay with me, because this is where Walter Briggs starts to rebuild, not with nails this time, but with quiet, steady justice. When Sophie said they needed more space, Walter thought she meant a few shelves or a closet. He didn't realize she meant him. It happened quietly, like most disrespect does. No shouting, no fight. Just a short talk over dinner with Dylan looking anywhere but his father's eyes. "Dad," he said, fork tapping against the plate, "Sophie and I were thinking maybe you could move into the living room for a while. You know, just until we figure things out." Walter looked up from his stew. "Figure what out?" Dylan sighed, his tone rehearsed. "It's just we've both been under pressure. Sophie's work calls are private and the bedroom's better for her setup. The living room's big enough for you and it's warm. You'll still have everything you need." Walter set his spoon down. "Everything I need." Sophie smiled, that polite smile that always carried a sting. "We'll make sure you're comfortable. I already put some of your things by the couch." He stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tightening. "I see," he said quietly. "You need the space, not me." Neither of them answered. The silence between them was louder than any argument could have been. After dinner, he walked upstairs. The door to his old room was already half closed, boxes stacked where his nightstand used to be. He stood there for a moment, taking in the hollow sound of nothing. He walked inside. On the floor lay a single picture frame, fallen during their redecorating. Helen's smile looked up at him from behind cracked glass. The two of them standing in front of this very house, the day they finished building it. Her hair was tied up, cheeks dusted with sawdust, eyes full of pride. He brushed his thumb over the glass, whispering, "Guess we built this place for everyone but ourselves, huh, Helen?" Then he picked up the frame, tucked it gently under his arm, and started packing his things. It didn't take long. Old men don't keep much. A few shirts, a shaving kit, his Bible, and the small wooden box Helen had carved for his birthday 30 years ago. When he finished, he turned off the light and looked around one last time. The walls he had sanded smooth with his own hands now glowed under new paint. Cold, lifeless. He whispered to the empty room, "Take care of her, Helen. She's got new owners now." Downstairs, the living room looked the same as always, except tonight it felt smaller. He laid his blanket across the couch, folded the corners neat like a soldier would. Then he placed Helen's photo on the coffee table, leaning it against a mug full of pencils. For a long time he just sat there, hands clasped, staring at the flame of the lamp. The sound of laughter drifted down from upstairs, Sophie's high-pitched giggle, Dylan's muffled voice. They were in his room now. Their room. He listened, not in anger but in a kind of tired disbelief. They laughed in the room I built. I slept where I stored my tools. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Maybe this was how things ended for men like him, not with yelling, not with a fight, but with slow erasure. His mind wandered to a summer years ago when Dylan was just a boy. They'd worked side by side in the yard, hammering planks for a treehouse. Dylan's small hands could barely hold a nail straight. Walter had guided him gently, saying, "Don't force it. Let the wood tell you where it wants to go." Now, it seemed his son had forgotten the lesson. Someone else was hammering, and Dylan was too afraid to speak up. Upstairs, laughter burst again, louder this time, careless. The sound cut through the stillness like splinters. Walter's face didn't move, but something behind his eyes did, something sharp, deliberate. He stood up slowly, walked toward the small breaker box near the garage door. the same one he'd wired decades ago when the house was just a frame. He lifted the cover, studied the rows of switches under dim light. His fingers traced the labels: master bedroom, upstairs lights, hallway. He found the right one. Click. The house went quiet. A second later, a voice called from upstairs, Sophie's. "Dylan, what happened to the lights?" Walter said nothing. He just leaned back against the wall, hands in his pockets, listening. "Maybe a fuse," Dylan muttered, footsteps above. "I'll check it tomorrow." Walter smirked faintly. "Tomorrow," he repeated under his breath. "Sure you will." He walked back to the couch, the room now lit only by moonlight filtering through the blinds. He poured himself a small glass of water, sat down, and let the quiet settle. The dark wrapped around him like an old coat, familiar, honest. It didn't ask questions. It didn't take anything from him. It just was. He looked at Helen's photo again. Her eyes seemed to glimmer in the dim light. "Guess it's just you and me again," he said softly. The night dragged on. Every creak, every gust of wind carried memory. The laughter upstairs had stopped. Maybe they'd gone to bed, maybe they were whispering about him, the old man downstairs, too stubborn to leave, too proud to speak. But Walter didn't care. Pride wasn't his problem. Principle was. People like Sophie thought silence meant surrender, that if a man didn't raise his voice, he'd given up. But silence, real silence, was power. It made people wonder what you were thinking, what you were planning, and whether they should be afraid of finding out. He knew exactly what he was doing. Not revenge, not yet. Just a reminder, quiet, simple, effective. He leaned back on the couch, closing his eyes. The air was cool still. From somewhere outside came the soft hoot of an owl, the whisper of pine trees brushing against the window. He smiled faintly. "That's better," he murmured. "A house should breathe, not buzz." He stayed like that until his breathing slowed, until the memories of laughter faded into the hum of the lake outside. The dark was no longer heavy. It was peace. The kind of peace that comes when you stop expecting people to understand what they've already chosen to ignore. Upstairs, Sophie lit a candle. The faint orange glow flickered through the curtain. Walter saw it from below, a small pulse of light against the window frame. He almost laughed. "Let her have her candle," he whispered. "I built the wires." He looked back at the photo on the table. "You'd laugh too, Helen. You always said I'd find a way to fix what's broken, even if that meant breaking something first." His voice grew softer. "Well, tonight I fixed the light problem." He turned his gaze toward the dark ceiling above him. Every nail, every beam, he could picture them perfectly. He'd placed them there with his own hands. They thought they could take the house away from him. But this place, this heartbeat of wood and memory, still answered to him. He closed his eyes, his breathing even now almost peaceful. That night the dark spoke louder than his voice ever could. And in the silence, the house, his house, remembered who it belonged to. 40 years. That's how long it had been since Walter first laid his hands on this land. Back then, it was nothing but dirt, rock, and wild grass that reached your knees. Helen stood beside him, holding a coffee can full of nails and a grin that could outshine daylight. "We can't afford contractors," she'd said, "but we've got 2 hands each. That's 4, seems enough to me." So they built it, the house by the lake. No blueprints, no fancy equipment. Just faith, sweat, and the stubbornness of 2 people who believed that love could take shape in wood and nails. Walter started with the frame. He'd come home from the lumber mill at sundown, his back screaming, and still work until midnight. Helen mixed concrete in a wheelbarrow, humming old country songs under her breath. The first wall they raised together nearly collapsed twice, but when it finally stood upright, she threw her arms around him and whispered, "Told you these hands could do miracles." He still remembered that night clearly, her laughter echoing against the half-built walls, the smell of fresh pine mingling with the scent of her hair. That moment felt like a promise that this place would always hold them, even when time tried to pull them apart. Year after year they added to it a porch, a kitchen window overlooking the lake, the little workshop out back where Walter built chairs for the neighbors. Every corner told a story. The crack on the third stair from that time Dylan tripped carrying a toolbox. The burn mark on the counter from Helen's first attempt at creme brulee. Every scar, every scratch, it was theirs. When Helen got sick, the house grew quiet, but it never stopped breathing. Walter used to sit beside her bed, sandpaper in hand, smoothing out the edges of a rocking chair he'd been working on. "You'll have this one on the porch," he told her. "You'll watch the lake every morning." She smiled, weak but certain. "You'd better make it strong," she said. "I don't plan on sitting still." But she didn't make it to that porch. The chair stayed by the window instead. Her blanket folded neatly across it, the scent of lavender still clinging long after she was gone. After the funeral, Walter couldn't bring himself to move a thing. Not a photo, not a book, not a mug. That room, their room, became holy ground. The air still carried her presence. The pillow still held the shape of her head. He'd open the window every morning just enough for sunlight to touch the floorboards she used to sweep. For years, that's how he kept her close, by keeping everything exactly where it was. And now, walking through it again, he barely recognized the place. The bed they'd built together gone. Her floral curtains replaced with cheap polyester ones that smelled like a store. Even the scent of lavender had been smothered by some artificial vanilla blossom candle Sophie probably bought on sale. Walter ran a hand across the wall, feeling nothing but smoothness, no cracks, no nails, no history. The gray paint swallowed everything. He whispered, "You even covered the pencil marks." There, beneath layers of new paint, he knew the faint numbers still existed, the ones he and Helen had scribbled while measuring the height of their children over the years. Rachel 7 years, Dylan 10, Dylan 15, finally taller than Mom. They were still there somewhere, buried under Sophie's version of modern. He sat down on the edge of the new bed, not even real wood, just hollow metal and pressed board. It squeaked under his weight. 40 years, he muttered, and this thing couldn't last 40 minutes. He looked around and felt something unfamiliar, not just sadness, but insult. This wasn't grief anymore. It was something colder, because grief meant remembering. This was erasure. They hadn't redecorated, they'd erased her. He stood and walked over to the dresser, the one piece they hadn't thrown out, probably because it was too heavy. His fingers found the top drawer handle, worn down smooth by Helen's hands. Inside, he found a hairbrush, hers, with a few silver strands still tangled in the bristles. He closed his eyes, inhaled slowly. For a second, it was like she was there again, standing behind him, smiling that patient smile. He could almost hear her voice. "Let them have their colors, Walter. The wood still remembers." He smiled faintly. "You always did believe in second chances." The lamp flickered slightly as wind pressed against the window pane. He turned it off and let the moonlight in instead. It felt more honest. He walked to the mirror and stared at the reflection of a man who'd given everything, 40 years of labor, 40 years of love, just to watch it be traded for trendy rugs and hollow walls. Some people remodel walls, he thought. Others erase souls. He picked up the small wooden box Helen had carved for him, initials burned into the lid, H&W 1979. Inside were tiny keepsakes, an old key, a fishing lure, a photo of her holding Rachel as a baby. He brushed his thumb over her face in the picture. "Guess I kept this house for both of us," he whispered. but I'm the only one still treating it like home. The moonlight caught the edge of the photo frame, a faint gleam that reminded him of sawdust swirling in the workshop, gold dust dancing in sunlight. He remembered that sight vividly, the hum of tools, the rhythm of the hammer, the smell of pine sap. He missed that smell more than anything, not just because it reminded him of his craft, but because it reminded him of purpose. Back then, every nail had meaning. Every swing of the hammer brought him closer to something that mattered. Now the house sounded different. The floorboards didn't groan when he walked. Sophie must have had them tightened. The echoes didn't sound the same either. The air was too clean, too light, like the place was holding its breath. He whispered, "A house shouldn't be quiet, it should speak." And his house had always spoken in the creaks of wood, the hum of laughter, the clatter of dishes. But Sophie's silence wasn't peaceful. It was sterile. He turned back toward the door, taking one last look at what used to be sacred. He knew he couldn't bring Helen back, but he also knew something deep down. You don't let strangers rewrite your story. He reached into his pocket, feeling the old ring of keys he always carried, one for the shed, one for the garage, one for this house. The metal was warm against his palm. It felt alive. 40 years, he said quietly. You can repaint a wall, but you can't paint over hands. He glanced at the ceiling, half smiling now. You hear that, Helen? I'm not done building yet. And with that, he turned off the light, closed the door, and walked back down the hall. Behind him, the faint moonlight stretched across the floorboards like memory trying to stay alive. Wood remembers, he thought, even when people forget. It started with something small, a smell of new paint that didn't match the story he'd been told. Walter noticed it one morning while making coffee. It wasn't just the room anymore. The whole house carried that scent of new. And new, to him, meant change he hadn't agreed to. On the counter sat a stack of envelopes, glossy, colorful, too thick to be bills. Sophie's handwriting was everywhere. Furniture stores, home supply chains. One of them even said premium interior redesign services. He frowned, running his thumb under the flap of the top one. Inside, he found a list. New dining set, light fixtures, custom rugs. The total at the bottom was more than he'd earned in his first 5 years of marriage. Dylan walked in, half asleep, holding his phone. "Morning, Dad, you're up early." Walter didn't answer at first, he just held up the papers. "What's all this?" "Oh," Dylan said too quickly, "that's just Sophie. She's been sprucing things up, making the house more comfortable." Walter looked at him. "For who?" Dylan chuckled, awkward. "For everyone, don't worry, she's got it covered." Covered. Walter repeated the word like he was testing how it sounded coming from his mouth. "How exactly?" "It's nothing serious, Dad. Sophie handled it." There it was again, that phrase. Sophie handled it, as if she ran the whole damn place now. Walter didn't say anything more. He just folded the papers neatly, set them down on the counter, and poured himself another cup of coffee. But his hands didn't stop trembling. Later that day, when the house was empty, he decided to take a walk through it. Not to snoop, just to see what else had changed while he wasn't looking. The first thing he noticed was the framed photo that used to hang near the stairs, the one of him and Dylan standing beside the first wall they ever raised together, both smiling like idiots, covered in sawdust. Gone. In its place, a mirror, perfectly centered, cold. He moved toward the study, the one he barely used anymore. Sophie had been storing paperwork there, bills, receipts, documents. The drawer creaked as he pulled it open. Inside, a small stack of envelopes with the bank's logo printed across the top. He frowned. Mortgage statements. Only he didn't have a mortgage. He reached for the most recent one. The date made his stomach drop, 2 months ago. At first, he thought it was some kind of clerical mistake. Then he saw his own name printed neatly across the bottom, Walter Briggs, followed by a signature that looked almost right. Almost. He held it closer, tracing the pen strokes with his thumb. The loop of the W was wrong. Helen used to tease him about how he always made it too wide. Whoever signed this didn't know that. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the ink until it blurred. He could feel his pulse in his ears. His first thought wasn't anger, it was disbelief. How could someone look him in the eye, share his table, and forge his name as if it meant nothing? He put the paper down carefully, afraid it might burn through his hands. Then he went to the workshop out back, the only place that still felt untouched. The smell of old wood hit him like a memory. He exhaled slowly, running his hand over the workbench. That same bench had carried the weight of every project he'd ever built, from Rachel's crib to Dylan's first desk. He reached into the drawer where he kept his small tools. Inside, among screws and bits of twine, was a carving knife with a maple handle. Its edge had dulled, but it still fit perfectly in his palm. He turned it over once, then walked back into the house. In the hallway near the kitchen, there was a spot on the wall, a single nail hammered there decades ago. It wasn't special to anyone else, but to him it meant something. The day they finished building the frame of the house, Dylan was just a kid, 12 maybe, and Walter had let him drive the last nail into that spot. Then he took a pocket knife and scratched into the wood above it. Dad and Dylan, 1992. It wasn't pretty, but it was theirs. He stared at that spot now. The engraving was faded, half buried under layers of paint, but he could still see it, a ghost of what once was. He took the carving knife, wedged it gently under the nail's head, and pried. The metal squeaked as it loosened, pulling free after all these years. He held the nail in his hand, rusty, bent at the tip, and smiled. "Guess I should have known back then, kid," he murmured. "You never learned how to drive a nail straight." The laugh that followed wasn't bitter. It was tired, the kind of sound a man makes when truth finally lands. He slipped the nail into his pocket, right next to the folded mortgage paper. The two things felt connected somehow, the start and the undoing. Outside, the wind picked up. The trees swayed like they were whispering to each other. Walter stepped out onto the porch and watched the sunlight cut across the yard. Helen would have said, "Don't jump to conclusions, Walt. Talk to him." He could almost hear her voice. He nodded slightly. "I'll talk," he said, "but not the way he expects." That evening when Dylan came home, Walter sat in the armchair by the window. He didn't say a word as his son walked past, tossing his jacket onto the couch. "Long day," Dylan muttered. "Everything okay?" Walter's voice was calm, almost too calm. "Tell me something, son. When you were little, you remember helping me build this house." Dylan paused, unsure. "Yeah, of course. Why?" "Do you remember what I told you about the foundation?" He frowned. "You said to make it solid, that if the base is strong, stands forever." Walter nodded slowly. "That's right, the foundation holds everything." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes steady. "But if someone weakens it even a little, the whole thing comes down." Dylan shifted, uneasy. "Dad, I don't." Walter raised a hand, stopping him. "I saw the papers, Dylan." The color drained from his son's face. "Dad, it's not what you think, it's just a temporary loan." Sophie said. "Sophie handled it," Walter finished for him. "Yeah, I've heard that line before." "Dad, please, we just needed some breathing room. The bank said it was fine." "The bank doesn't own this house," Walter cut in quietly. "I do, and now apparently so do they." The room fell silent. For a moment the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. Dylan swallowed hard. "I was going to tell you." "I'm sure you were," Walter said softly. "Right after the walls started falling in." He stood up, the chair creaking behind him. "You forged my name, son. You didn't just take money, you took trust." Dylan tried to speak, but no words came out. Walter brushed past him, heading toward the back door. "You go ahead and tell Sophie I saw the paperwork. Tell her I understand now." He paused, hand on the doorknob, but she should remember something. He turned slightly, eyes sharp but calm. "You can sign away a man's house, but you can't sign away what he built into it." Then he walked out, the screen door slamming behind him. In his pocket, the nail pressed against the paper like a heartbeat, one part memory, one part warning. He looked up at the roofline, at the beams he'd raised 40 years ago, and said under his breath, "Let's see how strong the foundation really is." It was close to midnight when Walter woke up to the sound of voices, faint, muffled, coming from upstairs. At first, he thought he was dreaming. But then he caught the rhythm of it. Sophie's sharp tone, the quick click of her heels pacing across the floor. He stayed still for a moment, listening. The wind outside was calm, so every word carried through the old vents of the house. "I told you, Mom, it's almost done. Once he's in assisted living, we'll sell it. It's wasted space anyway." Walter froze, his breath caught halfway out of his lungs. He sat up slowly, feet finding the cold wood floor. For a second he thought he must have heard wrong. Assisted living. Sell what? Then Sophie's voice again, lower now but clear enough. Yes, the bank's ready. We just need his signature to finish the transfer. I'll handle Dylan, he's too soft to stop me. Walter's heart started pounding, not in anger yet in disbelief. He'd built this house nail by nail, board by board. Every inch of it was a memory, Helen's laughter, his kids' footsteps, the sound of the lake brushing against the shore outside their window. And now this woman, standing in what used to be his bedroom, was talking about selling it off like a piece of scrap lumber. He rose quietly from the couch, careful not to let the old floor groan under his weight. The moonlight slipping through the blinds painted silver lines across his hands, the same hands that had built this home. They didn't shake, not yet, but they curled into fists, the calluses pressing into his palms. He moved closer to the stairs, each step slow, steady. The closer he got, the clearer her words became. The old man won't even notice. He's too sentimental for his own good. Once he's out, we'll refinish the floors, get new buyers in before fall. It's prime lakefront property, Mom. We'll make a killing. Walter stopped at the landing, his face hidden in the shadow of the hallway. His mind raced, not in chaos, but with an eerie calm. He'd been betrayed before in small ways. Disrespect, dismissal, a closed door. But this was theft with a smile. He felt something shift inside him, the kind of quiet fury that doesn't explode, it builds. He looked toward the thin strip of light under the door at the end of the hallway. Sophie's voice came again, softer now, but every syllable sharp enough to cut through him. Dylan doesn't have the backbone to stand up to him. He'll sign whatever I put in front of him. We're almost there. Walter leaned closer, his breath steady, his heartbeat heavy. She was pacing. He could hear her heels tapping against the floor, hear the faint rustle of paper. Then the sound of laughter, her laughter, cold, triumphant. That was when his hand went to his pocket, his phone. He'd never used it for much, calls from Rachel, the occasional weather alert, but tonight he opened the voice recorder. One press and a small red dot appeared on the screen. He held it close to the door, the phone trembling slightly as he whispered to himself, "You like handling things, Sophie. Let's see how you handle this." He listened for a while longer, every word sinking in. The talk of selling, the plans to move him out, the fake concern about his well-being. When she said, "He's old, Mom, he'll adapt," that was the moment something inside him hardened completely. He turned away from the door. Slowly, quietly, he walked back down the stairs, one hand sliding along the banister, the same railing he'd built with Dylan when his son was 12. He remembered that day clearly, the boy smiling, saying, "Dad, this thing's never coming loose." Walter had laughed, "As long as the foundation's honest, son." Now in that same house, honesty was what had gone missing. He reached the bottom step, the quiet creak under his boot sounding almost like a sigh. He sat down on the last step, staring at the wall in front of him. The house felt alive, like it was listening. His fingers brushed against the edge of the stair, feeling the old wood grain beneath his skin. Helen used to say the house was their third child. It needed care, patience, forgiveness. He smiled faintly. "You were right, Helen," he whispered, "but even children have to learn hard lessons." He opened the phone, checked the recording, the little red light still blinking. The sound waves danced across the screen, capturing every cruel word Sophie had said. "They weren't stealing money," he said softly. "They were stealing meaning." He thought of Dylan, the son who used to beg to help him in the workshop, who once promised, "I'll never let this house fall apart, Dad." Somewhere along the line, life and love and convenience had dulled that promise. Walter stood up, set the phone on the table, and stared out the window. The lake shimmered under the moonlight. The same moon he and Helen used to sit under when they couldn't afford a porch roof yet. He whispered, "You tell me to stay calm, so I will, but not still." The night was quiet except for the wind moving through the trees, soft, deliberate, almost rhythmic, like the sound of a saw cutting through pine. Walter took a slow breath, shoulders squaring, eyes clear. He wasn't going to yell, he wasn't going to confront them, not yet. He'd been building things his whole life. He knew that good structures don't start with noise, they start with planning, precision, patience. If they wanted a lesson, he murmured, picking up his old notebook from the shelf, I'll teach it quietly, the way wood bends before it breaks. He walked back to the workshop, the floor creaking gently beneath him like the house was nodding along. That night, the old man didn't sleep. He sat under the dim light of the shop, phone on the table, the recording playing softly, every lie, every plan, every betrayal echoing through the air. He took out his notebook, flipped to a blank page and wrote just one line at the top, "Blueprint for Justice." Then he smiled, slow and certain, the way only a builder does when he knows exactly where the next nail will go. The call came on a Thursday morning. Rachel was halfway through a deposition in Denver when her phone buzzed. She saw her brother's name flash across the screen, but when she picked up, it wasn't Dylan's voice she heard. It was Sophie's, cold, polite, sugar-sweet. "Hi, Rachel. Just a heads up, your dad's been a little off lately. He's been saying strange things about the house, and I think he's under stress. Maybe you could talk to him." Rachel frowned. "Strange things." Sophie laughed lightly. "Oh, nothing major. You know how older folks get stuck on the past. Anyway, we're having a little get-together this weekend. If you're free, maybe you could come by, calm him down." There was something about the way she said calm him down that made Rachel's chest tighten. When she hung up, she sat at her desk for a long time, staring out at the Denver skyline. Her father didn't lose his temper, ever. If anything, he was too patient. So if Sophie was calling her, something was wrong. 2 days later, Rachel was standing in front of the Briggs house. The same house her father had built before she was even born. Every nail, every beam, every window frame a piece of his story. She took a slow breath before knocking. The door swung open to the sound of music and laughter. The living room glowed with new decor, sleek, expensive, wrong. People she didn't recognize stood around sipping wine. Sophie, in a dress too polished for comfort, moved through the crowd like a hostess at an open house. "Rachel," she exclaimed, "you made it, how wonderful." Rachel forced a smile. "Hey, where's Dad?" "Oh, he's around," Sophie said vaguely. "Helping out a bit, can I get you something to drink?" Before Rachel could answer, she heard his voice, quiet, measured, from across the room. Walter was standing by the bar cart, pouring drinks for the guests. A man she'd never met said, "Hey, old-timer, careful there, not too much ice." Walter nodded silently, his back slightly bent, his face unreadable. Something inside Rachel snapped. She crossed the room in 3 strides. "Dad," she said softly, placing a hand on his arm. "What are you doing?" He looked up, startled, but smiled faintly. "Just helping out." Sophie said the guests. Sophie's voice cut in from behind, too cheerful. "Dad's being such a sweetheart tonight," he insisted. Rachel turned, her eyes cold. "He's not your bartender, Sophie." The laughter around them faltered. Rachel's voice was calm, but it carried through the entire room. "He's the man who built this house, with his hands, with his life. You don't ask a man like that to serve you." The silence that followed was heavy. Someone coughed, a glass clinked. Sophie's face flushed crimson. "Oh, come on, Rachel," she said quickly, laughing it off. "It's just a party." Rachel stepped closer, her tone unflinching. "Then maybe you should remember whose house you're partying in." The words hit like a hammer. Sophie looked around, searching for someone to back her up, but no one did. Dylan stood near the stairs, pale and quiet. Walter set the pitcher down carefully and said nothing. He didn't need to. His daughter had said what he couldn't. After a long, awkward beat, Sophie forced a tight smile. "Well, I suppose we'll wrap things up soon. It's been such a lovely night." People began to murmur, gathering their things, pretending not to look at Walter as they passed. Within 10 minutes, the house emptied. The music stopped. Rachel turned to her father. "You okay?" He exhaled slowly. "You didn't have to do that." "I did," she said simply. "Someone had to." He studied her for a moment, the corners of his mouth twitching upward. "You sound like your mother, that's the idea." They sat down at the table once the house was quiet again. The faint sound of crickets drifted in through the open window. Rachel reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "You were right, weren't you? Something's going on." Walter hesitated. "You don't want to get mixed up in this, Rachel." "I already am," she said. "What did they do?" He slid a piece of paper across the table, the forged mortgage agreement. Then he picked up his phone and pressed play. Sophie's voice filled the room. Once he's in assisted living, we'll sell it. It's wasted space. Rachel's jaw tightened. Unbelievable. Walter nodded slowly. They weren't stealing money. They were stealing meaning. She reached out, placing her hand over his. Then let's take it back. For the first time in weeks, he felt something shift inside him, not anger, not grief, but resolve. They spent the next hour gathering everything. Mortgage copies, bank statements, the recording, every scrap of evidence that could expose the betrayal for what it was. Walter worked in silence while Rachel organized the papers into neat stacks. It reminded him of when she was a kid, helping him sort screws and nails in the workshop, lining them up by size. She'd always been precise, careful. "You sure about this?" he asked finally. Rachel looked up, eyes steady. "You taught me the law of the house, Dad. Build it right or it'll collapse. This isn't any different." He smiled faintly. "Your mother would have liked hearing that." Rachel's lips curved into a soft smile. "Then maybe she's listening." They finished just after midnight. Walter sealed the evidence in a folder and handed it to her. "Keep this safe." She nodded, tucking it under her arm. "What now?" He stood, stretching his shoulders, the weight of age and betrayal sitting a little lighter on him tonight. "Now we let the truth do its work." Rachel looked at him curiously. "And Sophie?" He gave a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. If she wanted a fight, she should have picked someone who didn't build foundations for a living. The two of them sat quietly for a moment, the house still around them. Then Rachel said softly, "You know, when I was little, I thought this place was magic, that it could protect us from anything." Walter looked toward the staircase at the wood he'd sanded by hand all those years ago. "It's not magic," he said. "It's memory, and memory's harder to tear down than walls." She reached out, squeezed his hand. "Then let's make sure they remember." He nodded slowly. "This time," he said, his voice low, steady, certain. "Respect will have a witness." Morning came heavy, the kind of gray light that makes a house feel smaller. Walter had been up since before dawn. The coffee on the table had gone cold hours ago, but he didn't notice. He'd been staring at the folder Rachel left behind, the recordings, the documents, the proof, all of it sitting in a neat stack, waiting. When Dylan came down the stairs, his hair a mess, tie loose around his neck, he froze. His father was already at the kitchen table, the phone placed in the center like a loaded gun. "Dad," Dylan asked cautiously, "you're up early." Walter didn't look up right away. "Sit." There was something in his voice that made Dylan obey without a word. He sat across from his father, glancing at the silent phone. Sophie appeared a moment later, still in her robe, holding a mug of coffee. "What's this, a meeting?" She joked lightly, but her voice cracked on the last word. Walter's eyes finally lifted. "Yes," said evenly, "a meeting." He tapped the phone screen. A second later, the kitchen filled with Sophie's own voice. "Once he's in assisted living, we'll sell it. It's wasted space anyway." The recording was clear, cold, cruel. Sophie froze, her mug slipping from her hand, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Coffee spread across the tiles like spilled secrets. Dylan's head dropped into his hands. "Dad, Walter raised one finger, stopping him. "Don't," he said quietly. Sophie tried to recover. That's taken out of context. I was just venting, you know how people." Walter interrupted again, his tone flat. "You forged my signature on a bank document. That's not venting, Sophie. That's a felony." Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. He turned to Dylan. "And you knew, didn't you?" Dylan's lips parted, then closed again. His silence was louder than any confession. Walter leaned back in his chair. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the clock ticking on the wall, steady, merciless. He picked up the mortgage paper and held it between his fingers. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. "It's not just a document, it's a promise. One your mother and I made to build something real, something that would last. You used it like scrap paper." "Dad, please," Dylan finally whispered. "It got out of hand, I thought." "No, you didn't think." Walter's voice was calm, steady, almost too calm. "You let her think for you." Sophie straightened, her tone sharpening. "This is ridiculous. You can't just kick us out. Legally, we have rights." Walter's eyes met hers, and the look in them stopped her cold. "You want to talk about rights?" he said, his voice low. "You lost your rights the second you tried to steal what I built." He reached into the folder, pulled out a single document and set it on the table, the cancellation form for the property authorization. He uncapped a pen and signed it slowly, his hand steady. When he finished, he slid the paper across the table toward her. "You have 48 hours to leave." Sophie stared at him, disbelief spreading across her face. "You can't be serious." "I was serious 40 years ago when I promised your husband a home," he said. "This is me keeping that promise by ending it." Dylan looked up, tears threatening to spill. "Dad, where am I supposed to go?" Walter's expression softened for just a moment. "I don't know, son. Maybe somewhere you can start over, somewhere you don't have to lie." Sophie stood up suddenly, knocking her chair back. "You'll regret this. You'll die alone in this place." Walter didn't move. "Maybe, but at least I'll die in a house built on truth." She stormed out, footsteps heavy on the stairs. Dylan sat frozen, staring at the floor. After a long silence, Walter spoke again, softer this time. "Do you remember when we built the porch together?" Dylan nodded slowly. "You were 12. The boards were too heavy for you, but you kept trying. You dropped the hammer 3 times that day." A faint smile touched Walter's lips. "And I told you if you want it to last, you have to drive the nails straight." Dylan's voice broke. "I messed it all up, Dad." Walter shook his head. "No, son, you just forgot what straight looked like." Dylan's shoulders trembled. "I'll fix it, I swear." Walter reached out, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Not this time." He stood, walked to the wall near the kitchen door and took down the family photo that had hung there for decades, the 4 of them, frozen in better times. The frame was covered in dust. He wiped it clean with his sleeve, then set it gently on the table. "This used to mean something," he said quietly, "but now it's just a picture." He turned to his son, his eyes tired but clear. "You and Sophie should go before that picture becomes something worse." Dylan stood slowly. "You're really doing this?" Walter nodded once. "Sometimes love leaves," he said, voice low and steady, "and that's mercy." Dylan looked like he wanted to argue, to explain, to beg, but he didn't. He just nodded, lips pressed tight, and walked upstairs. Walter stayed where he was, staring at the empty chairs around the table. The house creaked softly in the morning light, as if it too was taking a deep breath after years of holding it in. He looked down at the photo one last time. Then he turned it face down and walked toward the back door. Outside, the wind had picked up. The lake shimmered under the sun, calm and endless. Walter stood there a long while, hands in his pockets, listening to the faint echoes of footsteps upstairs, the sound of leaving. He didn't smile, but there was a kind of peace in his eyes, quiet and solid, like a beam finally settling into place after the storm. 2 days passed before the house felt like it could breathe again. The silence was thick at first, the kind that settles after a storm, when even the wind seems cautious not to disturb what's left standing. Walter spent those mornings in his workshop, the smell of sawdust and oil grounding him back into something real. The rhythmic sound of his hammer echoed through the house, steady and patient, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm again. Rachel showed up each day with coffee, and that quiet determination he'd always admired in her mother. Together, they started restoring the rooms that had been stripped of their meaning. In the old bedroom, the one Sophie had claimed, the air still carried the faint scent of that perfume she'd used. Rachel wrinkled her nose. "God, it smells like a department store in here." Walter gave a half smile. "We'll fix that." He handed her a paint roller. "You take the corners." She grinned. "You sure you trust me with that much responsibility?" He dipped his brush in the pale cream paint, stroking it along the wall. "Not really, but I'll risk it." They worked in silence for a while, the scrape of the roller, the gentle clink of tools, the sound of their breathing in sync. When Rachel paused to wipe her brow, she looked over at her father and said, "You know, it's strange," painting over something she tried to erase. Walter nodded slowly. "Fresh paint covers walls, not scars." Rachel let the words hang there. "Then maybe we don't cover it," she said. "Maybe we just make it ours again." He looked at her, the hint of a smile tugging at his mouth. "That's the best idea I've heard in a while." By evening, the room looked different, not new, but honest. The sunlight caught the wet paint, turning it warm and soft, almost golden. Walter stood back, hands on his hips, staring at the spot where the old bed used to be. "She used to sleep right there," he said, his voice quiet almost to himself. Rachel looked up from her work. "Mom," he nodded. "Yeah." Every morning she'd complain that the window let too much light in, and every night she'd open it anyway. They stood there for a long moment, both smiling at the memory. Later that night, after Rachel went home, Walter sat in his chair by the window, a mug of tea in his hands. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, calm, almost mirror-like. He reached for his old notebook, the one where he used to sketch furniture designs and jot down reminders. Flipping through, he found a page labeled repairs and wrote 3 words underneath. "Start with peace." The next morning, Rachel arrived holding her phone. "You might want to hear this," she said. Walter raised an eyebrow. "What now?" She hesitated, then pressed play. The news reporter's voice was calm, but the words cut sharp. "Local contractor Dylan Briggs has been terminated following an internal investigation into falsified expense reports. The company confirmed the discrepancies after a client complaint." Walter blinked slowly, exhaling through his nose. "Expense reports," he murmured. He learned that from her. Rachel nodded grimly. "That's not all." She swiped to another article. "Sophie's insurance claim, the one she filed after that car accident last year. Turns out she faked half the documentation. They're pressing charges." Walter didn't say anything at first. He just leaned back in his chair, eyes unfocused, staring somewhere beyond the walls. Rachel watched him carefully. "You okay?" He nodded, but his voice came quiet. "I told you once the house knows its builder. I guess the world does too." She smiled faintly. "You think that's karma?" He chuckled softly. "Maybe, or maybe it's just gravity. You can't build on lies forever. Eventually things fall where they belong." The workshop door creaked open as a breeze swept through, carrying the scent of fresh paint and pine. Walter stood up, walking toward the open doorway. The lake gleamed in the distance, calm and endless. He picked up his chisel, turning it in his hand. "I spent years thinking justice had to be loud," he said. "Turns out it doesn't make a sound at all." Rachel leaned against the frame. "What do you mean?" He smiled faintly. "Peace doesn't shout, it just stays." They went back to work. The rhythm returned, sandpaper against wood, brush against wall, hammer against nail. The house was coming alive again, not because of revenge or punishment, but because truth had finally settled back into its corners. By sunset, the last of the light poured through the window and hit the wall where Helen's old photograph used to hang. Walter reached into his pocket and pulled out the bent nail he'd carried since the day he found the forged signature. He held it between his fingers for a moment, then pressed it gently into the wall, not to hang a picture, not to mark anything, just to remind himself. Rachel looked over, smiling softly. "You're putting it back." He nodded. "Not the way it was, the way it should be." They stood there as the last brushstroke dried, the smell of wood and paint mixing into something new. Outside, the lake rippled once, then stilled. Inside, for the first time in months, the house finally felt like home again. A month passed before Dylan came back. Walter was in the workshop that morning, sanding down the edge of an old chair leg when he heard the knock, 3 hesitant taps that didn't sound like a stranger's, but not quite like family either. He set the sandpaper aside, wiped his hands on his apron, and opened the door. Dylan stood there, thinner than before, his shoulders drawn in, eyes red-rimmed. He was holding a small wooden box, one Walter recognized instantly. The box had been theirs. Years ago, they built it together, back when Dylan was still a boy who believed that sawdust was magic dust. He'd insisted on carving his initials beside his dad's, crooked, uneven, but proud. Now, the same box trembled in his hands. "Dad," Dylan started, his voice barely more than a whisper, "I don't deserve this house." Walter didn't answer right away. He looked at the box, then at his son, not with anger, not even disappointment, just a long, quiet look, the kind that strips away excuses. Finally, he said, "You don't." Dylan's throat tightened. He nodded slowly. "I know." Walter took a breath, stepped back, and motioned for him to come in. "But you can earn back the man who built it." Dylan blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" Walter turned toward the workbench and opened a drawer. Inside lay an old hammer, its handle worn smooth by decades of work, initials etched faintly into the wood, WB. He held it out. "You remember this?" Dylan reached for it, his hand trembling. "Yeah, you used to say this hammer could fix anything." Walter smiled faintly. "That's because I was stubborn. Thought I could pound my way through life and call it building." He placed the hammer in Dylan's palm, closing his son's fingers around it. "But I learned something. A hammer can break or rebuild. The choice is in the hand that holds it." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air smelled of pine and varnish, the soft hum of the lake drifting in through the window. Dylan's voice cracked. "I can't fix what I did." Walter shook his head gently. "You can't undo it, but you can make something new." Dylan looked down at the hammer. "I don't even know where to start." Walter nodded toward the half-finished chair on the workbench. "Right there." Dylan frowned. "That old thing, it's falling apart." Walter chuckled softly. "So were we." They stood side by side for a while, unsure, awkward. Then Walter handed him a nail. "Start with this. Steady hands, don't rush it." Dylan lined up the nail, his grip unsteady. The first swing missed, glancing off the edge. Walter didn't correct him, didn't sigh, he just watched. The second hit landed true, a solid thunk echoing through the room. The sound lingered, familiar, comforting. "That's it," Walter said quietly. "You remember the rhythm now." Dylan looked up, eyes glassy. "It's been a long time." "Yeah," Walter said, "but rhythm's funny. You don't lose it, you just forget how it feels." They kept working in silence, sanding, fitting, hammering. Every strike felt like a word that didn't need saying, every breath a small apology made without sound. When the chair finally stood again, it was crooked, imperfect, but solid. Walter ran his hand along the edge. "Your mother always loved this chair, said it creaked like an old song." Dylan smiled faintly. "I remember she used to sit here and read by the window." "Yeah," Walter said softly. "She said the chair reminded her of me, rough around the edges but steady when it mattered." Dylan laughed quietly, the sound breaking into a shaky exhale. "She wasn't wrong." Walter grinned, eyes soft. "She usually wasn't." They stood there, both staring at the chair, the air between them lighter now. Finally, Dylan spoke. "Dad, I don't know how to thank you." Walter looked at him. "Don't, just do better, build better." Dylan nodded slowly. "I will." The light shifted through the workshop windows, golden dust floating in the air like it used to when Dylan was a boy. The hammer rested on the bench, quiet but alive with history. Walter picked it up and turned it over in his hands once more. "Funny thing about wood," he said. "It remembers the hands that shaped it, even the mistakes." Dylan watched him closely. "Does it ever forget?" Walter smiled. "Not if the builder learns." Outside, the wind rustled the trees, the soft rhythm of the lake returning like an old friend. Walter reached for another nail, handed it to Dylan. "One more," he said. "Let's make sure this thing holds." They leaned in together, the hammer rising and falling, each strike measured, patient. The sound filled the workshop, thunk, 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 steady as a heartbeat, steady as forgiveness taking form. Walter stepped back and wiped his hands. "There," he said, "good as new." Dylan smiled faintly. "Not perfect, though." "No," Walter said, his voice warm. "Better, because now it's real." As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the floor, the two men sat in the quiet workshop, the repaired chair between them, a little uneven, a little scarred, but standing tall. Neither spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. The sound of the hammer still echoed in their chests, and for the first time in years the house and the men who built it finally felt whole again. 6 months later, the house no longer smelled of paint or dust. It smelled of sawdust again, the clean, honest scent of work. The sound of hammers and laughter mixed in the air, bouncing off the walls of Walter's old workshop. He'd reopened it, not as a business, but as a place for kids who needed something to hold onto. Most of them were from the local shelter, kids who'd been tossed around by life the way cheap wood gets tossed aside in a lumberyard. Walter figured if he could teach them to shape something steady, maybe they'd start believing they could be steady too. "All right," he said, tapping his workbench with the back of his hand. "Lesson number 1, a good piece of wood never complains when you sand it, it just gets smoother." The kids laughed. One of them, a quiet boy named Kevin, raised his hand. "Does that mean if we complain we're not good wood?" Walter chuckled. "Nah, it means if you can take the work and keep showing up, you'll end up stronger than you started." He handed Kevin a block of pine. "Now start with this. Don't rush. A craftsman doesn't fight the wood, he listens to it." Rachel arrived halfway through the session, standing quietly in the doorway. She didn't want to interrupt. Her father looked alive again, steady, focused, his hands moving like he was conducting an orchestra instead of a class. There were little details that made her heart ache in the best way. The way he still wiped the bench twice before setting tools down, the way he hummed under his breath while measuring cuts, the way the kids leaned in close when he spoke. She watched as he pointed toward an old nail embedded in one of the wooden beams above. "You see that nail?" he said. "Been there for 40 years, never rusted, never bent." A girl in the front asked, "What's so special about it?" Walter smiled. "That nail held up the first frame of this workshop. It's not the biggest or the prettiest, but it did its job. It stayed true." He paused, looking around the room. "You want to know the secret to lasting like that?" Every head nodded. He tapped his chest lightly. "Respect, for your craft, for others, for yourself. Respect isn't asked for, it's built like this house." Rachel felt her throat tighten. She'd heard him say similar things when she was a kid, but back then they were just words Dad talk. Now they sounded like gospel. After class, when the last of the kids had left, she stepped inside. He was wiping his hands on a rag, the sunlight catching the silver in his hair. "Full house today," she said softly. He looked up, surprised, then smiled. "Yeah, they're a good bunch, eager to learn, terrible listeners." She laughed. "Sounds familiar." Walter raised an eyebrow. "You talking about you or your brother?" "Probably both," she said, grinning. He sat on the edge of the bench, taking a sip from his mug of cold coffee. "It's funny. When I started this, I thought I was teaching them how to work with wood, but turns out they're teaching me something too." Rachel leaned against the doorway. "What's that?" He glanced around the workshop, his eyes landing on the old chair they'd fixed together months ago. "That even the broken pieces have a purpose if you're patient enough to fit them back right." She nodded slowly. "You sound like Mom." He smiled softly. She'd probably say I stole her lines. They fell into a comfortable silence. The wind outside moved through the trees, the sound blending with the faint creak of the old rafters above. After a while, Walter spoke again, quieter this time, almost as if he were thinking out loud. "You know, Ratch, I used to think silence meant defeat. Back when all that mess happened, when Dylan and Sophie tried to take the house, I kept asking myself if I should have yelled, fought harder. But I see now, silence isn't surrender, it's craftsmanship. You can't build peace by shouting." Rachel watched him carefully. "Do you ever regret not saying more?" He shook his head. "No, because I didn't stay silent out of fear. I stayed silent out of choice. There's a difference. When you know what's right, you don't need to make noise, you just keep building." She smiled, eyes glistening. "That's one hell of a quote, Dad. You should put that on a wall." He laughed quietly. "Maybe I will, but knowing me, I'll just carve it into the bench." He looked down at his hands, rough, scarred, steady. "These hands have built, broken, rebuilt, and somehow they're still steady." Rachel took his hand gently. "They are, because you never stopped using them for good." He squeezed her hand back. "You can't retire from what you were made to do, Ratch. Some folks talk about legacy like it's money or a last name, but legacy's what you leave behind in the people you've taught to build after you're gone." The workshop door creaked open again. Kevin peeked in, holding a crooked wooden birdhouse. "Mr. Briggs, I think I messed it up." Walter smiled. "You didn't mess it up, you just gave it character. Bring it here." As the boy walked in, Rachel stepped back, letting her father take over. He examined the birdhouse, turned it over in his hands, and said, "You know what makes this perfect?" Kevin shook his head. "The fact that it's yours," Walter said simply. "That's what makes it worth keeping." He handed it back, patted the boy's shoulder, and watched him beam. Rachel's eyes softened. "You really built something special here, Dad." He nodded, looking around the room. "Not just me. Every kid that walks in adds another beam to it." As the sun dipped lower, casting long stripes of gold across the workshop floor, Walter picked up his hammer, the same one he'd once handed to Dylan. He set it gently on the table beside the old wooden box. "If you've ever been pushed aside by the people you built your world for," he said softly, as if speaking to no one and everyone at once, "remember this, your silence isn't defeat. It's the sound of a craftsman choosing peace over noise." Rachel smiled through the quiet, her eyes reflecting the late afternoon light. "You should tell that to more people, Dad." He looked up, that calm, steady grin spreading across his face. "Then you make sure they hear it." She nodded. "I will." Walter glanced around the workshop one last time, the smell of pine and varnish filling the air. "Funny," he said. "For a house that went through hell, it sure feels brand new again." Rachel took a deep breath. "Because you rebuilt it the right way." He smiled. "Yeah, respect isn't asked for, it's built like this house." Outside, the sun slid behind the trees, the sound of the lake steady and calm. Inside, the lights from the workshop spilled warm and golden through the windows. If you listened closely, you could still hear the faint echo of hammer strikes, steady, patient, eternal, the sound of a man who'd turned silence into strength. And if this story reminded you of your father's quiet strength, share it. Let good men be heard.